striking to see so much. I mean, they're now in such a short amount of time, under 20 years, a lot's popped up. But all of these people lived on the other side of the island and so now have been displaced and are trying to move businesses across, move families across, and it's clearly present a lot of complications. And as much as the volcano also changed the landscape of the island, they're changing the landscape of the island to accommodate for people living on the side now. So they've been leveling out some things, like Linda mentioned, they're building a new capital city, which is, I think, really fascinating to see. You don't see that much in the 21st century, a new capital city being built somewhere, but you can see like bulldozers and flattening out different parts of the landscape so that they can build on top of it. So
the landscape that remains is the very hilly part of the landscape, and so there is some agriculture. We hope to show you just outside the window, which we may try and do. There's a coconut tree there, there's some banana trees, but in terms of ground agriculture, that's not possible. So this used to be a food exporting island, and it's now a food importing island. So they realize they have to change the economy. There's a lot of build going on now, and so that's sustaining some of the economy, but obviously for the long term, they're going to have to look to something else. So they came up with a tourist plan, or I should say a national cultural policy. It was established by an NGO led by Professor Sir Howard Fergus. And a committee. He's an eminent historian on the island, part of the UWI system. And they had focus groups and tried to find out what people wanted in terms of policy. But they recognize that, or they believe that tourism has to be a part of economic sustainability for the island. When we went on the tour yesterday, they were talking about having a small cruise ship port. They were talking about high-end tourism. It's clear they can't have mass tourism, so it's going to have to be pretty small scale. Harbor's not that great for huge ships. So one of the things that holds the island together and has always a tradition, they have a number of festivals. And the traditional festivals, the biggest festival is at Christmas time, a week between Christmas and New Year's, and that's actually how I got interested in this in the first place. And in those processions, there have been competitive troops called bands that would come out, and each neighborhood would kind of compete against each other about who had the best music each year, who had the best costumes. So that was the major festival. The biggest festival is the St. Patrick's Day Festival. A lot of the early settlers were Irish, some of them indentured servants who then went on to become planters themselves. So they're actually proud of their Irish heritage here. The St. Patrick's Day Festival is also, or primarily now, a celebration of their African heritage. And the majority of the island's population, over 90%, has some African heritage, so it's an Irish-African celebration. That occurs in the spring. There's a literary festival, and then there's the festival we're attending now, which is Calabash, and it's a food festival. It's a festival that's been invented in the past 15, 20 years. It's a invented tradition.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting things that we've already kind of seen being around the festival, but it is really interesting to new festival, especially it being a post-volcanic eruption festival, because the structure of it seems a little bit different from what we've read about the other festivals, where there was a little bit more competitive aspect between the different areas of Montserrat, because those areas don't really exist anymore. This festival in particular is very focused on Montserrat as a unified nation. Also, as part of Britain, that came through, their Irish heritage came through. We went to, so the thing that we've gotten to experience probably the most in terms of the festival so far was last night we were able to go to a gospel choir concert at a Pentecostal church, and different performers came, so it was primarily religious centered performance, but what was really cool was that it was people from different denominations and people of different nationalities who participated in the festival. So it wasn't just Montserrat, but there was a Canadian performed, a younger man from Jamaica did some rap was a harmonica player, some gospel harmonica. I'd never heard that before. Also,
The youth
there was
band.
a youth group. Yeah, they were really great. And there was a dancer as well. A young woman did a lyrical, she was Montserrat, but she did a lyrical gospel performance where she danced to gospel songs. So it was really an interesting group of pieces. I think it spoke a lot to some of the themes that we've been seeing with how Montserrat is kind of conceptualizing its identity post-volcano, and how it's incorporating much more of an international, I think, focus.
The other element in the international dimension is that even though there's a population outflow, there is also large-scale immigration, large-scale in comparison to the rest of the population. There's a shortage of labor, there always has been in the Caribbean, as people who lived here left. And a lot of the low-wage jobs have been taken up by people who've migrated here from the other islands, so Haiti and Jamaica, for example, seeking opportunities. And the reason for coming to Montserrat in particular is that because they're still part of the UK, who works here for a set number of years can then get a UK, which is essentially a UK passport, which allows them to work in the European Union. So they see this as a route to upward mobility. So you see young people from other islands here, and as Nicole mentioned, one of the couples who were singing last night, a duet, was a couple who sang in Creole, who were Haitian. I found the Jamaican singer interesting. I said to Cole, don't tell. Singing was okay, his dancing was pretty fabulous. And he had called himself Shamrock Gal. So taking on a combination of his Jamaican heritage, but taking that Shamrock name as his acting name or his singing name, so tying in with the theme of Montserrat. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to that generation of people. Do they become part of Montserrat? Do they continue to claim that as part of their heritage if they do migrate on? But again, it's a very transitional kind of period in the history, and the attempt to solidify culture reflects that.
Yeah.
So,
and I think in kind of not the absence of tradition, because certainly we've seen so many different traditions being portrayed in what we saw last night, but also the idea that we're creating a new Montserrat and pushing forward into a better and brighter future, I think was very apparent in the music that a lot of them chose. A lot of the themes of the songs had to do with moving forward, children being the future, having a brighter future faith. So there was, like I said, a very strong religious undertone to the performance. And also the idea that faith was a really stable point for people, which I think was emphasized a lot because of how much change has happened for a lot of the people on the island. Mm-hmm. It seems like that's a really common theme that was constantly emphasized in the song that we're saying. There was an MC of the event who was kind of putting in his 2 cents between every song. He was pretty great. But there was a lot of commentary that went along with the performances. So there were songs, but then the MC was talking about Montserrat and about their heritage and about
their unity. I think the unity, like I said, Nicole started to say that before the volcano there was an emphasis on a competition, and now the main message seems to be the unity of the people here, including new people who come back from overseas to enjoy the festival, to meet with family. So unity seems to be a primary message in this new tradition. And if I say invented tradition, those of you who've read Hobsbawm recognize that. That's not meant in a negative term, that's meant in how does culture and tradition continue to be a living entity in people's lives, to give their lives meaning. As Nicole said, the themes of the songs fed into that, and the final song was called Can't Go Back. And we were hoping to upload that. I don't think that managed to upload yet, but eventually it will. So I hope you can log into our website at some point to hear that, because it was fairly moving. One other thing that was interesting to me, the structure of the music was the way that procession seems to be an element in performance more generally. So what we came to see was a traditional masquerade procession where people dress up in costumes and process, parade, and they dance, and they have drummers with them. Sort of like the Debra, but much more on foot and acoustical music, and acoustical costumes, I guess you could say. Procession and the idea that people moving together in a group is part of the way that you assert the unity of the group. One of the things that struck us yesterday at the concert was at the end of the concert, this last song, Can't Go Back, there was closing prayer, there was a vote of thanks, which is traditional, and then the MC said, now we will all go out together, we will process out together to this song. So for those of you who are familiar with traditional Christian processions where the choir will process out, in this instance, the choir stayed in one place, they sang, the congregation joined in, and then the audience actually processed out to this song, sort of almost marching, not quite, it wasn't that formal, out, and it made a very joyous spirit, but there was a sense of unity embedded in that. One of the YouTube videos we did manage to upload, we didn't make it, it's very professional as you will see, also takes a processional format, and I hope there'll be time for you to get that. It was made by the people of Montserrat for the Queen's birthday celebration. You'll see it has a very Montserrat twist to it though, and the person who is leading the procession, who is leading the dance, is the governor of the island. So that would not be immediately apparent from looking at the video. But again, the importance of procession and creating unity among the people who are participating in this particular celebration. Do you want to talk about the public history?
Sure, yeah, just to, I guess, so that's what we've seen so far. We've only been here for, I guess that's, I think Linda mentioned that here at around 4 yesterday, so we haven't been here super long. But we are also doing a public history component to the project, so we're doing research on tradition, memory, and processions, but we also decided to do a public history-oriented project which involves using different kinds of media to communicate history or record history. So we're hoping to do some oral histories with some of the performers that we will typically meet throughout the week. And so we're working on setting all those things up. It's a little bit more laid back in Montserrat, so it's a little more stance. But we'll see how those go. But we're also doing some things on social media, and we made a project website. So I sent Charles the link, and I can send other people the link too if you're interested in what we're up to. We're in post a couple times a day, and we also have a Twitter and an Instagram, and we're posting pictures and updates of what we're up to and what we're doing. It's kind of an experiment in seeing how some of those media translate with project, a history project, but also a way to preserve some of this information, some of the photos, some of the interviews. So the interviews will also be uploaded to the website. Some of the footage we got last night I'm working on uploading to the website, and just information about the project to hopefully, on one hand, make people more aware of what work we're doing as historians, but also make people more aware of what we're talking about. So Montserrat and what's going on in Montserrat, which is not a very widely discussed issue, I would say. And hoping that we can contribute a lot of what we record and gather to the Montserrat archives, which is something that's kind of work in progress for the island, since most of it was destroyed in the volcano and displaced with others. So we're hoping to contribute in that way as well.
Just as an aside, in terms of how small an island is, we landed at the airport, we didn't have a cell phone that worked here. Someone else said, oh, we know exactly where you're going, here's a call for you. I know the brother of so-and-so. And I talked to somebody after the concert last night, and I was on the phone to someone this morning, and I heard, oh, you've already talked to Pat Ryan. So we're going to have to be on our best behavior while we're here in Skipper, a small island. I was also hoping that, I know you want to stay on schedule, but take your computer out just to show you a little bit of the landscape out the window here. I think the goats have stopped bleeding, and certainly the roosters have stopped, are We're going to lock this stuff, but just so you can get a sense of what it looks like.
So I don't know what you can see as much, but this is the view of kind of the guest house of some of the hills nearby.
Tilt it down.
Tilt it down?
Yeah, there we go.
I can't see you. I have it facing away from me. So.
Okay, that's
okay,
good
so
right there.
This is some of the landscape. Here's a coconut tree.
The volcano is behind us, so we can't show you.
Consistent. Otherwise, it's kind of where we're at, though. And like I said, if you're interested in more pictures and things, those will be going up online. So the rest of the festival then for this week includes a children's choir concert, which we've got tickets for. The big jump up parade, which will be on Saturday. There's a food fair. We'll suffer somehow. And then there's a music festival on our last day. And then the final lecture, historical lecture on the last day as well. So that's where we are. Do we have time for questions? Anyone have any questions?
I think, what was that? Did somebody? I think maybe given the format, I mean, maybe do we have one burning question?
Yeah.
That it would be kind of tough to do, but thank you for reporting in, and good luck with the rest of the festival.
We're going to sign off.
What?
Okay, thank you to the Sangers. This was a great experience.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Oh, what have I done?
Major.
So we're going to begin actually by giving you a little performative taste of the sutra, the Buddhist sutra that we've been working on over the course of the summer. And we're going to try to do this by memory, but we've got some backup just in case the nerves make us unable to remember the piece. So I will start. Sasagara tyakta vasundaratara yada babuva nirpachakravarti chatvari dvipani saratna purna niryatita purva jineshu mahyam
Nadshasti tadvastu priyamanapam purvam chamahyam nachatyaktam asit tam dharmakayam pariyeshanartam priya jivitam tyaktam aneka kalpam
Yatapurva kalpeshu achintiyeshu ratna shikisya sugatasya shasane parinirvritasya sugatasya tasya susambhavo nama babuvaraja.
Sa chakravarti chatudvi paishvaraha samudra paryanta mahim prashasti jinendra goshaya charajadaniye supto babuva tada raja kunjaraha.
Svapnantare buddhagunam shunitva ratnochayam pashyati dharmabanakam stita suryamadye chavirochamanam prakashayantam imasutra rajam.
Svapnadvi buddhascha babuvaraja pritisputam sarva shariratasya abhinishkraman raja kulat prahrista upasamkrame shravaka samgam agre.
So I hope you could actually see what was up there. It seems a little bit unclear, but yeah, I don't know. Oh, okay. Thanks. Woo. It's all or nothing, right? Okay. We can work with that. Oh, perfect. See, there we go.
Ah.
Okay.
Okay.
So let us just say a little bit before we go on with our slides, a little bit about the project and how it developed. So our project this summer, as we initially conceived it, was to further some work that I've been doing on Buddhist sutras over the past several years, where I've increasingly become convinced and have developed the argument that these sutras, which have been read for at least a century or more by scholars as doctrinal works, are in fact works meant for dramatic oral performance. And that this performance is in fact meant to substitute for sacrificial rituals. So a very important kind of way in which the text is a thoroughly embodied experience, right? And so my goal this summer, working with Jessica, who's done a year of Sanskrit with me, was to think about the consequences of this understanding of the sutra for the ways in which we translate it. How do you translate a text that is meant to transform its listeners and speakers in the process of its performance versus, say, a strictly doctrinal work, right? But our project did change over the course of the summer for reasons, various reasons, mainly having to do with the differences we discovered in our interests and inclinations, which was very useful, and Jessica's going to tell you a bit about that.
Yeah, so I came into this project with a strong interest in performance studies within the study of religion. So I'm really interested in what we call embodiment practices, so how practitioners evoke values and doctrine and text through their actions. So I really wanted to focus on what people do, and that ended up sort of transforming our project, because as we started to engage in these textual practices like memorization, recitation, and started reading the texts, I realized that for me, an important question to ask when thinking about translation is, how do you read the text? And when you're translating something, you are also trying to create a reading experience for those that you present the translation to. And I also started to ask questions about how my own approach to reading affected the way that I wanted to translate it. So it started to turn into this ethical question about what my role was as someone studying this and about to take responsibility for representing the communities that produce these sutras and engage with these sutras all the time. And so we started to shift and sort of look at something that was closely related to what Natalie was doing, but a little bit in a different direction, and sort of starting to study the ethics of scholarship when dealing with sutras.
Yeah, which has also been a long-term component of my research, so it fit really well with what I was doing, but it was just a shift away from where we had initially thought our focus would be, which was on the translation per se.
Yeah.
Okay, so we wanted to start just by framing up the academic study of religion a little bit, because I know that there are often misunderstandings about this. And especially given the way we started the presentation, we could actually further those misunderstandings. The academic study of religion is quite different from the practice of religion, of course. We're studying how people in different times and places have thought, lived, and practiced within religious communities. In many ways, the scholar's perspective or positionality very often doesn't come into the picture explicitly. It depends on the scholarship, but there's a way in which the field is still, although it's changing, largely defined by the distance from the object of study, right, of the scholar. That may be problematic, and in some ways I think some of what we're doing is calling that a little bit into question in some ambiguous ways.
Yeah, and so to continue off on that, what we did was not a common approach to studying sutras, and that's also applicable to study of other religious texts. And so we're starting to try and call into question the ways that scholars have traditionally been studying these texts and sort of push those boundaries a little bit. But this isn't an arbitrary choice either. What sort of compelled us to approach sutras in this way, to engage in performances with them, is because the texts actually told us to. So I'm going to move on to sort of the study of Buddhist sutras themselves. And one of the things that we found to be really remarkable about these texts was that they challenge the traditional boundaries that scholars have set between their scholarship and the practice of Buddhism. And then the same is true with other texts and other traditions. And we started doing these things that the text asks us to do. You know, it says, memorize me, copy me, recite me for others. And we started feeling a little bit ambivalent, I think, because we were kind of like, well, what is the difference between what I'm doing and what a practitioner is doing? Because we are practicing with the text in many ways. But that became a key question for us, sort of what practices count as scholarly and what practices count as Buddhist. And trying to sort of pick apart the individual goals of the scholar versus the individual goals of the practitioner, and then who gets to decide what those things are. It's a really difficult question and not one that we have answered yet. But one thing that we did sort of differentiate is that scholars are mainly interested in figuring out how the texts work. And we actually went and visited a Zen Buddhist community. And when we participated in the things that they did with the sutras, we realized that it didn't really seem like they were worried about how the text works, but they were just trying to make it work. And so trying to sort of understand those two perspectives is something that we've also been working through. And so, you know, as a scholar then, we kind of have to ask ourselves, if the text is claiming that some transformation is going to happen, and to understand how a practitioner conceives of that transformation, shouldn't we engage in the practices that they encourage?
So yeah, and a couple points. You know, scholars, of course, are engaging all the time in precisely the practices that the sutra demands, right? It says, read me, study me. Maybe they're not always memorizing and reciting, right? But a significant range of the practices that the texts encourage people to engage in are standard scholarly practices. But most scholars don't recognize that they've entered into the relationship with the text that it's asking them to engage in, right? And so in some ways what we're doing is really talking about what happens if we start to develop an awareness of the ways in which we are doing precisely what the text is asking of us, right? And another point I would want to say, sort of understanding how it works, right? As a scholarly goal is not one that many scholars have. This is, I think, one of the things that we're moving toward is trying to move the goal of scholarship from sort of understanding the tradition in some sort of historical sense, what happened, or how these texts were used, or whatever, into sort of really internal to the text. How is the text creating a particular kind of experience and potential for transformation? The people who wrote these texts were very sophisticated about their use of language, and the ways that they're performatively manipulating and shaping the listener or speaker are really incredible. So we want to sort of take that seriously and try to understand what's going on there, rather than assuming, as often scholars do, that people who would believe these texts believe, and I'm moving on to our next points here, are simply afflicted with some form of false consciousness, which is clearly, I mean, in much of the scholarship, the assumption that people come in with, right? So this is why we want to focus on this question of belief. I think Buddhist texts really challenge a lot of notions that we have, assumptions about religion as having to do with what people believe. I know from many of my introductory students that when people come into religious studies classes, their assumption is that that's what religion is, right? What people believe. But actually these Buddhist texts challenge that very strongly. Belief is not a prerequisite for engaging with these texts at all. In fact, there's a concept that's articulated fully in the Lotus Sutra, one of the texts in this class of texts that we've been looking at, called Upaya Kaushalya, which means skillful means. And the point is precisely that what the Buddha taught was not necessarily true at all, right? It's a wild idea. He taught not what was true or real, so you just believe it, right? But he taught what you need to know in order to be transformed, in order to be awakened, right? And so the idea of the text as efficacious rather than a sort of a set of doctrines or beliefs that people have to adhere to is built right into this understanding of the text. Why not then do what the sutra says if it's not about belief? I mean, I'm a thoroughly secular human being, I have to admit, and it's, I'm not doing this as a Buddhist at all. I'm doing this because I think that the text has something there in terms of the way that it's using language and what it's doing that's worth understanding and highly sophisticated, right? So why not, expand the range of scholarly practices from some of the things that the sutra already asks you to do, reading, reciting, or studying the text, to a much broader range, chanting, memorizing, copying the text in order to understand better how the text works. And so, one of my long-term interests as a scholar is in reading practices and how they're historically and culturally located. And so really asking sort of, what does it mean to read in a South Asian ritual cosmos, I guess, is the emphasis in my scholarship. And so I want to sort of really think about where those boundaries between scholarly reading and religious reading are, and we've been able to do a lot of that together this summer.
Yeah. So just to kind of talk about what we did, we worked primarily with a sutra called the Sutra of Utmost Golden Radiance. And so part of what we did was we translated it. So we spent some time each day just sort of working with the Sanskrit and translating into English and sort of paying attention to the choices that we made about whether we preserved it in verse form, what, how we sort of began our sentences or and different things like that. And we studied the text, so we tried to sort of read it and think about it and apply it to our experiences and think about how it could be applied to various contexts. And we also engaged in some memorization and practiced some recitation. One of the things that I did was I created a memory palace, so to experiment with this memorization. And I went through my childhood bedroom and applied parts of the sutra to that space. And it was actually a pretty effective method. But that was really fun. I don't know if you want to mention some of the other things.
Yeah, and we also, as I think Jessica mentioned earlier, we did attend a few services at a Zen Buddhist monastery that's in Monroe, Wisconsin. I had some connections there, and I knew that the Zen master, she's really very interested in the role of sutras in Buddhist practice and very thoughtful about the way she incorporates them. So we took part in a morning service where there was chanting of sutras, and we also had a really interesting conversation with the folks there about the way that they're using sutras in their practice, and you know, how they felt about it, what kind of component of their practice it was. And really that was very affirming of a lot of the theories that we had about the way the texts were functioning. They touched on a number of the things that we had already sort of identified. So that was actually really affirming for us. And I also, I'm going on sabbatical right now, and I've got this book project, which I'll tell you a little bit about at the end. But as part of the sabbatical and the writing of the book, I've decided I'm going to copy the entire sutra in gold and silver ink on dark blue paper. Here's an example. I've got about 6 double-sided pages of this kind, and I will have over 90 by the time I'm done. So it's a large project, but something that I've found, you know, I mean, I'm not doing it in a sort of strictly ritual sense. If you're really doing this properly, you'd sort of bathe every time before you started writing and wear pure white clothes and do all this kind of thing. And, you know, I will admit that sometimes I copy it with a glass of wine in my hand. But it is still, I find, a process whereby I feel a greater sense of intimacy with the text. I mean, just on a fundamental level, really there's a kind of bodily link that's there that does actually add something to my understanding in important ways.
Could you read just the first line? Could you read it out so we can follow?
I don't know if I can see it clearly enough. Let's see. Atayusman Anando. Okay. Oh yeah. Atayushman Anando, Bhagavantam Etad Avochat. How about that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is where our focus was then at the end of the project. By the end of the project was on the ethics of scholarship. So one of the things that we want to say is that the relationship between the scholar and the text, right, that we're talking about, it's not like that relationship doesn't exist every time a scholar opens a text and reads it, right? It's, though, not often acknowledged or even maybe necessarily recognized, but it's always already there. In other words, when you engage with a text of this kind, you're bringing a whole set of assumptions already to what it means to read the text and what a text even is, right? That are coloring the way that you interpret it. That's just, you know, of necessity. We all bring those kinds of assumptions to what we do. So part of what we've been working on over the summer is thinking about how recognizing that relationship, helps us to engage with questions of how we're relating to the text and the ethical issues that raises. Now, I myself am fairly happy just imagining those relationships for the most part. I haven't actually pushed myself that much before this summer in working with Jessica to engage in these practices myself, right? I've got a pretty good imagination. I've been able to sort of work at this over the course of the past several years of my research, imagining what the performance would be like, but actually doing it does add something to it.
Yeah, so I'm a huge proponent of basically becoming a participant. So trying to embody the relationship that the text is introducing to you. And so I really wanted to go to the Monroe community, and I wanted to participate in rituals because for me, I feel like there's a way in which engaging in the bodily practices that the text pushes you to do commits yourself to it in a way that imagination can't do for me. And there are pros and cons to both methods. Imagination in a lot of ways allows you to sort of envision many different outcomes, many different responses, and many different ways that the text operates. Embodying the relationship forces you to confront the reaction that happens and the response that happens. But an important thing that sort of we took from that is what you allow the text to do. So if you allow it to sort of physically manifest itself, it does something very different from imagining it, and determines the nature of the relationship and what you can learn from it.
I'm noticing that we're kind of short on time here, so let's very quickly, you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, so my goals for this, I've been writing a paper that I would love to take to a conference at some point. I may have to edit it a little bit because I think that I could do a lot more research to improve what it is right now. Maybe put it towards further writing work for an honors thesis, something like that. But this research is really applied to sort of broader work that I want to do, and thinking about how to represent others and make ethical choices about the people that I work with in the future.
And as I mentioned, I'm embarking on a book project. The book is called Reading Rituals, or Reading Rituals, which explores how reading text as ritual performances shapes our interpretation of them and the ways in which we interact with them as scholars. So we'd like finally to offer sincere thanks to Jim and Marge Sanger for really the wonderful experience that we've had working together this summer. It's been so productive and in such unexpected ways. So thank you so much.
Well, maybe a minute or two for questions.
This is kind of directed towards Natalie. And maybe it's too personal a question. I don't know.
But go for it.
Because a lot of what you're
Yeah.
talking about is at this intersection between scholarship and yourself, I
Yeah.
guess. I don't know how else to put it. But I just picked up on one thing that you said in kind of an offhand way, and an almost kind of nervous offhand way, a kind of apologetic way. You said, I'm a thoroughly secular person.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you are as committed to that characterization of yourself now as you might have been at the beginning of this project, given what the notion of secularization or secularity that you might have been referencing is more prefaced on belief than efficacy.
Yes, that's right. No, that's exactly right. So I would guess I would say when I describe myself now as a secular person, it's more in a sense of this is how I've been shaped as a human being by forces beyond my control, not by a set of sort of commitments that I have. I question very much, actually, the kind of assumptions of a kind of neutral, secular lens that people can bring to the world. It's a strong worldview, and one that I've inherited through my upbringing, not one to which I feel, at this point, really a strong commitment, I have to admit, yeah.
I was really curious. I think what's so cool about the sutras you were reading is that they're self-referential, right? And they talk about their own transformative power. And so they're sort of describing this intimate relationship that you're forming with them. But I wonder how doing this project has changed the way you think about reading in general, right? Do you think that like intimate transformative relationship is still there with other texts, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there are different types of texts. So one of the things that I've said to Natalie a lot is that for me, one of the things that I find to be so powerful about religious texts in a lot of ways is that they sort of ask for a very intense relationship in a very explicit way, which is different, I think, from some of the texts that you read. But I also think that that's because I wasn't looking for that originally. So the problem is we've sort of been reading a lot of this stuff, but I am interested to see if sort of applying that kind of perspective, viewing other texts as sort of an intimate partner or whatever, one that's sort of asking me to really, really see myself from the perspective that it's presenting, changes the way that I understand them.
Yeah, and I guess I would say that the way I read anything has been fundamentally transformed by my engagement with these texts, right? Like really, really, it's taught me how to read in a completely different way that I find incredibly valuable. So, yeah.
Wondering about thinking about text as transformative rather than true is interesting, and then thinking about the relationship of belief and understanding. But my question is related to those thoughts, but really about the content of the text, because it seems if the text has the potential to transform, it seems that one might want to take a lot of care about the content of what you are sort of ingesting.
Yes, yes. Exactly, that's exactly the right metaphor. The sutra itself uses that, the sort of the eating, eating the text sort of metaphor, yeah.
So it seems that if you're being transformed by this, that it's possible you could also be transformed by a toxic text.
Yep. That phrase occurs in the title of Jessica's paper.
Yeah.
You're really, right on. Yeah.
Your research team.
Yeah.
There is this, I think there's a real danger when you start to think about reading as this transformative experience, then, if we take the metaphor of food seriously, right, you are what you eat. You got to make sure you eat things that you want to become because you're taking them into your body and they're changing you, right? That's the metaphor, but I think it works actually with reading. And there's some neuroscience that these days on reading practices and what happens to your brain that actually backs this up as well. I don't know if you want to say anything more about toxic texts.
Well, yeah, I think that's an important point to think about, especially since part of the challenge of engaging with these texts is sort of figuring out a way to find a compromise between the way that I see the world and want to see the world and the way that the sutra wants me to see the world, which is a really hard thing to come to terms with, especially if I want to sort of fill a practitioner's shoes in some ways when I'm studying them. So yeah, I think a question that we always want to be asking is, do the texts that we read have our best intentions at heart? And if they don't, how do you still treat them in a fair way and sort of give them a fair shot?
Yep.
Becky and I are both in the biology departments, and she's going to be continuing this project for a senior manuscript to be published in the Beloit Biologist, and I will be continuing it for a couple of years to come, and I'll talk about that. So today I want to give you some background to the project and then turn it over to Becky, and she's going to do a more focused aspect of the project. Okay, so the stream of interest is Spring Brook. Let me go like that because that runs between Beloit and Clinton. Basically, effectively, the headwaters of the stream is the Clinton wastewater treatment plant. And then the stream kind of meanders through this agricultural area, comes into Beloit, and goes through the industrial park and other parts of Beloit, and eventually empties into Turtle Creek, which is about right there. Throughout the past few years, I've kind of concentrated with students here, and also I have some sample sites out in the agricultural area. This year, we're focusing in this particular area, and it's really important because it's really at the boundary between agricultural areas to the east and urban areas to the west. It's also the only place we could do the particular kind of study that we wanted to do. And so I'm going to focus in on that red box area. So here's the I-90-43 intersection. Cary Ingredients owns that whole piece of property. Hormel is right here, and the stream comes from up there, meanders through here, and then goes down a little bit to the south, takes a jog over. These markers here are temperature data loggers that we deployed, I like that word, deployed in the stream. And this most downstream one is right downstream from the Hormel plant. They have permission to release effluent into the stream. And so we wanted to see how temperature was affected by that effluent. And then there are 3 other data logger sites. And we're going to mainly today focus on these 3. The idea was to study how stream riparian vegetation is the vegetation that grows along the stream, could affect the temperature of streams. And so between these 2 points, that's 400 meters or about a quarter of a mile, it's what we're calling open. It's lined by grasses that don't shade the stream. And then between 14 and 15, there are lots of trees that cover and shade the stream. Okay, so we predicted that in the open area, the stream would warm. And I'll get back to those data in a bit. So from this bird's eye view, I think you can maybe see how it looks different, but let's go down to ground level. This is the so-called open area. This was early in the season. The grasses have grown up quite a bit. But you can see it's open, and it's looking downstream towards the area that becomes covered by the trees. And if we go into there, it looks more like this. So you can see that they look very different. So lots of shading by the trees. So you can see that they look different. We're in biology, so we have to quantify the differences. And the first, probably a lot of time was spent quantifying differences and similarities in each section of the stream. And I'm only going to talk about 2 kinds of data, light and temperature. So first with light, what we would do is put out a tape, and then every meter take a light reading. Okay, and we did this in the shaded area and the open area, and these are the data. So these are meters along the transect, and that's light. And so you see they're very different. And we would expect that. So the open area is consistently well lit. The forested area is not as consistently, but low lit. And these peaks are where there's a break in the canopy, so letting in some more of a diffuse light. If we look at temperature, Becky is downloading data from this data logger. This is basically like a big flash drive that she downloads it to, and then we could take it back and download it to the computer. That data logger, after she downloads it, goes into this protective PVC pipe, and she secures it. The PVC pipe is attached to an 8x12 brick, so then we could put that back in the stream, and hopefully it doesn't go anywhere in high flows. It hasn't so far, so that's good. If we look at some of these data, the first one is from the most upstream side, so the beginning of the open area. And so temperature on this axis and date, and we are looking at data from an entire week from 5 to 11 June. And what you notice is that there are daily fluctuations. Each day has a minimum, which typically occurs around 7 in the morning, and a maximum, which occurs about 3 in the afternoon, at least during this week. If there's lots of sun, you have big fluctuations. If you have a cloudy day, you have little fluctuations, or even presumably we'll see some without any fluctuations. Okay, so if we add then the next one going downstream, so right at the boundary between open and forested, we have this. So as predicted, there is an increase in stream temperature as it goes through this 400 meters of open area. And that difference can be up to 2 degrees, at least in this week. But it doesn't really change the minimum. So overnight, the temperatures are pretty much the same. If we add the next data logger in, that is pretty much the same as the other part. So as it goes through the forested area, there's really not a difference in temperature. Okay, so the biggest change occurs in the open. These data loggers will be out there probably until November, or whenever this California girl can handle still going out before it gets too dark. So then we'll have, and November, because that's when leaf falls, and so it really doesn't matter to leave it in all throughout the winter. If I add the Hormel data, this will be more of a long-term study. The Hormel data shows a lot different temperature than in the other ones. So both the minimums and the maximums are higher. And that's because they're releasing water. We could tell that they're releasing water late in the afternoon every day, except on Sunday, when they don't release water, presumably. I haven't checked to see if that's always the case. And so there are these big fluctuations. Presumably in winter, they will be really big fluctuations. So these loggers will stay in over the winter, and then get retrieved in April to see, or May or whenever, to see how the temperature changes. Temperature is important to stream organisms because stream organisms aren't like us. They can't regulate their body temperatures. And so their temperature takes on the temperature of the stream itself, which in turn affects their metabolism. So it has big effects on organisms. So I'm going to turn it over to Becky, who studied stream invertebrates in the open shaded area and the shaded. So actually temperature is not coming into play in interpreting her data. Okay, but do you want this?
Yeah.
So first, what are stream invertebrates? Well, they're insects either in a larval or an adult stage that live within the water of a stream. And they spend majority of their lifetime, if not all of their lifetime, within the stream. As you can see in these two life cycles of some common invertebrates, a mayfly on top and a caddisfly on bottom, they spend a significant amount of time in a larval or nymph stage in the aquatic ecosystem, and then emerge for a very short amount of time in a terrestrial adult form. And so they spend, because of this, they spend a lot of time in that water, and as Carol mentioned, little changes within the water can affect how they survive or how they live. And so different things such as temperature or riparian vegetation, which allows like food for the invertebrates, so different leaf litter that falls into the stream, or other different changes within the water will greatly affect the invertebrates because they spend so much time in the water. So I sampled these invertebrates in 2 different riffles, which are rocky areas in a stream where the water flows over the rocks and it oxygenates the stream a lot, flowing over these rocks. And riffles at the end of the open section, so the interface between the open and the shaded section, and at the end of the shaded section, which is completely shaded by trees. And so how I sampled at these riffles was using a D-net, which you can see in this picture, is a net with a D-shaped frame that you stick into the stream perpendicular to the flow, and then you disturb the bottom of the substrate, bottom of the stream, by kicking and doing a little dance to mix up the bottom of the stream to get all the invertebrates that are holding on to the rocks and down in that substrate in the bottom of the stream. And then you also pick up rocks within that area, so we sampled like a half-meter square within this riffle and removed the rocks from that area and brushed off the invertebrates again into that net to catch any invertebrates that are within this area. And so then to get the invertebrates out of the net, I emptied the net into that white pan here filled with some stream water, and then sieve that stream water through a sieve to get rid of the excess water and some smaller debris. So there is a lot of aquatic plant life and some pebbles and rocks that are also collected and preserved because invertebrates are found within a lot of this material, and you got to get them all. Can't just leave some there. So there's a lot of material to go through. And then so we preserve those in alcohol in the field, and then into the lab they go and get sieved again with 2 different sieves to separate the fine material and the coarse material. And then I spent the significant amount of the portion of the summer in the lab identifying these invertebrates using a dissecting microscope, and that's where a lot of my summer went, was identifying these different invertebrates. And so these are pictures of some of the invertebrates, some of those common invertebrates that I found. And there's everything from some fly larvae, like this non-biting midge, to the black fly and the caddisfly and the mayfly there, to also adult forms, such as like riffle beetles, scuds, and sow bugs. And so you get quite a variety of different invertebrates within these different riffles. And so how do you analyze these invertebrates is through functional feeding groups, which are how the process they collect their food and how they get the material that they get their nutrients from, instead of sort of what they eat, because invertebrates are often pretty general feeders and they all eat quite a lot of different things. And so this is splitting them up into different groups based on morphology and behavior. And so the different functional feeding groups, as you can see, are collector-gatherers, collector-filters, scrapers, predators, shredders, and piercers. And they all work together to create the system of feeding. So, for example, shredders shred the leaf debris or matter that leaf or plant material that is in the stream, that lands in the stream from, for example, the riparian trees, and then shred up that material, that coarse particulate organic matter, into fine particulate organic matter, which then is collected by collectors, and they get their nutrition from that, as well as and then the predators eat the variety of different other feeding groups. and scrapers scrape off algae and other plant material that is growing on rocks or hard surfaces within the stream. And so they all work together to create this system that they all get their nutrients from. And another way to analyze the invertebrates is through biotic indices. And biotic indices show how the quality of the water in the stream. So each invertebrate is assigned a tolerance value, which is how much pollution or toxins or other sorts of materials they can withstand. So different types of invertebrates have different amounts of that pollution or whatever they can survive in. And so they're assigned a number between 1 and 10, where 1 is the least tolerant, so they really need pretty good clean water, where 10 is they can survive most pollution. And so then you calculate using those tolerance values a biotic indices, biotic index, which shows sort of the quality of the water. And so for my 2 different sites, the interface between the open and shaded section and then the shaded section of the stream, the biotic index showed good quality overall, so there's no difference between those 2 sites in the biotic indices. But I have just started to analyze using the functional feeding groups, and here's a bunch of the numbers, and you can see there's some difference in, I've just started to analyze this, so it's a lot of numbers right now, but I sampled in 3 different dates, so early June, mid-June, and then early July. And I sampled almost 4,000 invertebrates in total. And so you can see with the collectors were the largest groups in both the sites. And I'm starting to see some different trends within those collectors. So this is collector gatherers and collector filters on the right there. And so in the open section, you can see that there's a significantly more collector gatherers in the open part of the stream than the shaded, and then that as time goes on, they decrease. And not really sure exactly why yet. I've just started to analyze this data and figure out sort of what's going on. And then sort of opposite happens with the collector filters. There's more of them in the shaded, and they increase as time goes on. And so I'm going to be continuing looking at this data and analyzing it, and what I found in next semester for my senior manuscript. And so this project is going to be continuing for both of us, and we're sort of in a very limbo stage that's being sort of figuring everything out. And so I'd like to thank, of course, the Sangers and Sanger Research Fellows Program, the Biology Geology Department, and Carry Ingredients.
With the graphs that you were just showing about the differences in the shaded and sunny areas in percent of invertebrate that showed up, are you just looking at one sunny area and one shady area? Because
Yeah.
I was wondering if you're going to expand that and look at another sunny area, another shady area, because it could the difference just be caused by like maybe this group is more concentrated in that spot and this is there, and it might not necessarily be related to being shaded or sunny.
Yes, I'm only sampling in one spot, but it's very true, it could be that, but they're the same sort of environment. They're both riffles, and they're both within sort of the same stream. And so one of the only differences that we've found so far is the riparian vegetation and the light that's being let through. And so I've sampled them, as you saw, 3 different times, and so that's creating a little bit richer of a sample size, but overall.
We're very limited as to where she could sample because there aren't a lot of riffles in the area. And riffles are usually the best place to sample to get the greatest diversity of organisms. And so we tried to compare apples to apples rather than otherwise we'd have to compare apples to oranges. And there really are only those riffles that she's working in.
There's only about 2 riffles in that stretch of the stream.
Yeah.
And that's, as Carol said, the most diverse area for invertebrates.
Did the did that follow what you expected initially, or is there anything surprising in that?
Well, I expected, because shredders they eat the leaf material, and so I expected there to be more shredders within the shaded area because there's more food for them to eat. And it's sort of not showing really any sort of trend. It depends on the sample. So like one sample here, you can see it goes as I expected, there's more. But then it sort of switches the next two samples. So I'm not really sure what's happening there. And yeah. And also I've also read that there's more scrapers in where there's more light because more algae can grow because more of the photosynthetic light is being let through.
And part of the problem is the timing. So this is in the summer. The ideal time to probably be doing this and comparing forested to non-forested is right after leaf fall. So October would be the best time, but you'll be busy doing other things at that time, and these samples really do take a big chunk of time to process.
Yes.
studies major, and Professor Majeed works in the religious studies department. We did a project this summer on women's religious authority in Catholicism and Islam. This is something that we've both been sort of interested in for a long time, but from different angles. Professor Majeed has done a lot of work around women's leadership and authority, but specifically in Islam. This last year, I was working on a paper on feminist biblical hermeneutics, which is where I did a lot of reading with Catholic women who were interpreting the Bible for sort of feminist purposes. And we were talking quite a bit, and we were thinking through how we might bring these two different faiths together and look at them through a comparative lens. And I think there are some really special parallels that we saw through bringing these two groups together.
And what we did is our research incorporated 4 elements. We did collaboratively, we engaged in close reading of secondary texts. We conducted 2 interviews with religious leaders who share the religious traditions of the members of the focus group we would later study. One of our interviewees was Dr. Amina Wadu, who is one of the first Muslim women to lead a mixed-gendered congregational prayer in the United States. And we also interviewed Sister Joanne Persh, who is an outspoken advocate for human rights and has been engaged in human rights work for 45 years. And she is also a member of the Sisters of Mercy community in Chicago. Thirdly, we conducted 2 focus groups. One of Catholic women in Beloit, the other of Muslim women in Chicago, both very outspoken conversations. And these women were in their early 40s to late 70s and all engaged in activist work in their local traditions. And finally, Sarah's engaged in, traveled with Sister Joanne for an observation at a detainee center in Illinois.
Yeah, and I can talk about that really briefly. I got this really special opportunity to go down, and I spent the night with some volunteers who are really involved in this organization. It's the Interfaith Committee for Detained Immigrants. And then I went down at 5 o'clock in the morning to the Broadview Deportation Center and was working with Sister Joanne and a lot of other volunteers who are involved in this committee. Because they go there every single week. Every Friday is deportation day, right? And they do a lot of work around pastoral care. So being with the families, giving them information. If they're religious, providing them with spiritual care. Sometimes it's more just having a shoulder to cry on or someone to talk to, something like that. It was a very moving experience. When Hathaway was leading our group or we were talking about what left the biggest impression this summer, that was first thing in my mind. So that was a really special thing I got to do this summer. One thing that we'll talk about just a little bit, and I know a lot of you have experienced this, but we wanted to talk about how special the collaborative process has been. I think one really special part of working together is having a conversation partner. I hadn't done anything like this where I was working so closely with a faculty member, and it was really great to have someone who is coming from a really different perspective. I mean, not only are we in very different places in our lives, but we come from different faith backgrounds, have different experiences with Catholic and Muslim communities. So that was really helpful to have someone to bounce ideas off of and play devil's advocate and you know, really challenge different ideas that we were coming to the table with. I think having those different lenses really just opened up all of these different questions that I probably wouldn't have considered if we hadn't been working as a pair and talking with each other and questioning each other.
And this notion of having the liberal arts in practice was particularly profound on our trips back, right? So when we would have our hours, 2 hours car drive from Chicago, we would sit and talk about, okay, so what really happened and what did she say? This is what she meant, right? And one of the things that Sarah was grappling with was the notion of how to wrestle with the paradoxes and contradictions that can emerge in a research study when you come in with certain assumptions about what people do, say, and the reasons why, and then you encounter those people and they don't necessarily fit into the boxes that we have, right? right? And so one of the things that the liberal arts and practice helps us see is that coming from different lenses, we bring different perspectives, but perspectives that deal specifically with the practitioners and some of the issues that they're engaged with, so that our reading of them as text can actually reflect their voices much more so than us imposing our assumptions upon them.
Putting words in their mouth.
Yes. So we'll let you read our thesis, and as you do, you can see that that there are certain keys that we are trying to, that our research, I should say, generated. And that is that the experience of these Christian and Muslim women rebuke the stereotypes, stereotypical representations of them and of their traditions. For them, their faiths are not monolithic, definitely patriarchal, and they're clear on that, right? But at the same time, they're engaged in just and empowering forces that enable them to be actively engaged in both their public and private spaces. And for them, public is their beingness in their larger concentrations, in the mosque, in the parish, okay? And their private spaces allude to the time that they have to spend on their religious texts. When they think about authoritative texts, they're talking about the revelation, not necessarily how it's interpreted by somebody else, but how they internalize these texts. It also provides them with a sense of self. How do we see ourselves as women, as Catholic women, who maybe want to be leaders in our church at the level of a priest? And we know that in Catholicism, women aren't yet ordained as priests. But the good news is the Church of England has just indicated that next year it will begin ordaining women as bishops. So there's still hope. Private sphere also means taking time to gain knowledge about your tradition and the sense of worth that you can contribute in your own community.
All right. So one thing that brought up a lot of sort of interesting insights for us is when we talked to these focus groups about how they defined words like leadership and authority, because we saw a couple of different kinds of definitions popping up over and over again. One, it seemed like for a lot of people, when they heard the word leadership, they were thinking about action-oriented roles, right? What tasks are these people performing? What are they doing? Versus authority, which some people thought of as being like an institutional role, right? You have a title, you have, a place in the hierarchy. Although it was interesting because as we talked to people, we had some women be like, well, that's not how I think of authority at all. Authority isn't an institutional role. It's not a title that you get. It's a kind of individual potential, right? And something that any person can claim. And that's authority to interpret a sacred text, authority to act in their community, to be leaders. And so we saw as these women were talking, this sort of breakdown of what we were thinking about, this importance of a title or of a specific role.
Or the perception of what the importance was, because, as Sarah was mentioning, for them, title wasn't the issue. For them, what was authoritative was the text, even was a text as revelation, even though they may pivot with their own agreement with what is said. What's authority is their experience, their personal experience, not only their personal experience with the text, their personal experience with the hierarchy, and their personal experience in the grassroots communities that they engage.
Yeah. And so I think we saw, as we were going about this, that for a lot of these women, authority wasn't something that could be restricted or taken away. It was something that individual people had and could claim.
Definitely.
Which really got us thinking about this issue of public and private spheres, right? When we were deciding who we wanted to interview for this project, we were looking at people who are very vocal, very political. Amina Wadud definitely is someone who has been very, gotten a lot of media attention, right? And same with Sister Joanne. But I think in talking to these focus groups, we realized that was not the only important kind of claiming authority. And we saw all of these women who
engage in activist works on a local level. But another really important thing that they're doing is just going home and talking to their family members, talking to their friends, talking to people in their local parish or
Giving
community.
small sermons and
Right.
teachings, in smaller circles.
And so many of the women we talked to were involved in education, right? And you wouldn't think of them as like public leaders, but they do have influence, and the way that they express their beliefs and their authority was very, very important, I think.
And so the way that they would pivot the public and private spheres was another demonstration of the lack of awareness sometimes scholars can bring to a religious situation when they have assumptions or presuppositions about the limitations that these traditions place on the women involved.
So we're going to play a couple of different clips. This is Majeed, by the way, one of the women we were interviewing. So we're going to play one clip first. This is from the focus group we did with Catholic women. And we were asking, this is a woman who thought of her beliefs as being much more liberal than those of sort of the church hierarchy, right, and the doctrines coming out of the Vatican. And so we asked her how she reconciled that, how she remained within a church where, the leaders or the most public figures were much more conservative than the beliefs that she really held closely.
Okay.
This is what she said.
My conscience is up to me to develop. It's my conscience, and I'm responsible for that. And so that's kind of like a gyroscope, I think, inside of me that isn't really affected by who's at the helm of the church. That it's up to me because I'm accountable to what I believe. And if I disagree with things the Catholic Church does, I have an obligation to live as if I disagree with them.
So you can see that negotiating individual authority has to do with being subversive on some level. And this is the same for Amina Waddu. And she will talk about negotiating individual authority in terms of finding her voice.
I had discovered what I felt was the absence of my voice in reality in this entire corpus of material that's known as the discipline of Islamic exegesis or tafsir. So I was actually trying to just, number one, find the voice, number two, identify a voice, number three, speak through the voice, and number four, accept that that voice was part of the divine message and the divine intention, despite its absence in the discipline.
So in summary, it appears that both Christian and Muslim women navigate their traditions with a very simple mandate, and that is start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. So we are grateful for the continued support of the Sanger family. We want to also express our appreciation to Professor Ellen Joyce, who assisted in the organization of the Catholic Focus Group, and to Jedediah Rex from ITS, who helped us with our audio tracks, and also to Professor Greg Buchanan, who assisted us with the IRB approvals. And finally, I'm especially appreciative to the Sanger family because some of the data we collected on religious authority helped me make the final revisions for my book on Muslim marriage that's coming out next spring. Thank you. Questions? Hey?
I have a question that's a parent's question.
Yes.
Last talk,
Mm-hmm.
which is that you select two groups, one Muslim group,
Mm-hmm.
one Catholic group, and are making some assertions about differences or similarities between those two groups as Muslim or Catholic rather
Mhm.
than just two groups of people. Have you thought about how you might extend this study to provide greater robustness to the assertions that you're making about the nature of these two groups?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is hard, right? Because we can't really think of this as sort of a sample that's going to tell us something about what it means to be a Catholic woman or a Muslim woman in general. I think our focus was more at reaching out to communities that were close to us, hearing what they had to say, and then sort of raising questions in ourselves about what that meant. And I think it would be too ambitious to say that we could somehow speak for all Catholic and Muslim women. But
one of the things that we were trying to do was, first of all, when we identified the religious leaders that we did, okay, we were looking for people who were out front. And then when we developed the focus groups, we were looking for people who were on the sidelines, okay? And so we were also looking for people who understood that they were in patriarchal traditions and were wrestling with the positionality of that, right? One of the concerns initially that Sarah had was perhaps the Catholic group, for example, may be too liberal. And maybe that liberalness will be coded in some way that will skew our findings in a sense. And when we talked to, we had experience with the focus group, of course, we discovered that there is not a monolithic way to even talk about what is liberal, okay? Right. And that they were on various streams of conservative action versus liberal interpretation versus liberal action and all the way through. And we found the same dimension on the Muslim side. And both groups had, particularly the Muslim side, had very difficulty giving us a definition for religious authority, okay? Because they saw themselves as not in need of any visible kind of position that suggested what the outside world would determine was authoritative. For them, they didn't need to become female imams, for example, okay? Whereas on the Catholic side, they were pushing for the ordination of women priests. So we did have these differences, and their similarities came together in very interesting ways for us. So yeah, that would be another study, but that wasn't the study that we were looking for. Okay, thank you very much.
And we have 20 minutes, right? 20. Okay. The benefits of coming last and the drawbacks of coming last, right? Everyone's tired, so thank you all for staying and bearing with us. That's the drawback. The benefit is having heard all of the wonderful presentations, I realize even though our projects are really extremely varied, there are lots of common experiences and a kind of camaraderie that we can experience having gone through these 8 weeks of a wonderful program. And more than one last time, I really want to thank Jim and Marge for sponsoring this. It's been truly remarkable for these 8 weeks for me. I know I speak for everyone else too who's already thanked you. But the opportunity to work with David over these 8 weeks has been a truly enriching experience for me, one of my favorite teaching experiences thus far in my career at Beloit. So our project has focused on a series of texts that I grew interested in several years ago. They're relatively new to the scholarly field. Some of you have already heard me present on it, but for the benefit of those of you who are unfamiliar with these texts, I'm going to go very briefly through an introduction of what they are. Then David's going to speak about 5 of the texts that we spent intensive time studying, and then at the end, I hope that I will have time to actually read to you some excerpts of translations that I have done of one of the novels, because I think that I've talked about to many of you about these texts, but there's no substitute for actually hearing the voice of the text, even though it will be in translated form. So these texts that I'm talking about are an archive of novels that were written for a fiction contest that was sponsored by this man here, John Fryer, Fulanya is his name in Chinese, who was a missionary. He was originally born in England, missionary in China for the majority of his life, and then in the latter part of his career, he moved with his family to California, and he was the first professor of Chinese at the University of California, Berkeley, at the very beginning of the 20th century. And very end of the 19th, very beginning of the 20th century. He's pictured here in his official Qing Dynasty government robes, because he was an official in the Qing Dynasty government, as I'll explain. He went to China as a missionary, but he quickly transitioned from spreading the gospel to spreading the gospel of science. And these two streams of cultural interaction between China and the West, one, the religious stream, and the other, the scientific stream, merged in this period in the Western Chinese interaction, because the missionaries thought that science was completely compatible with their religious faith, and also a way of convincing people of the validity of their not just scientific beliefs and worldview, but also their religious worldview. So it was seen as a missionary tactic at first, but it grew, and with interaction with the Chinese Chinese were capable of disentangling those strands, and many of them were just much more interested in science rather than religious belief. And so there was a kind of tension between what was being taught and what was being learned, and what people then were doing with the materials that were being transmitted from one culture to the other. So this project looks at these archives of novels that were written in response to Fryer's call for a series of fictions to be written to address the 3 evils of Chinese society. So I mean, there's already a certain discourse embedded into the call for the fiction that can be critiqued, and certainly David and I talked an extreme amount about that as we were going through the 8 weeks. But the 3 evils are opium smoking, foot binding, and the examination essays. These were the root of all evil in Chinese society, and they were fixing those then would bring China into the modern age and allow her to stand on her own 2 feet as a nation among other nations. As David will explain, the fiction contest was the outgrowth of actually a 10-year period of prior contest, which was focused on essay writing. And the essay writing was enmeshed in the Chinese education system. When John Fryer first arrived in China and transitioned to scientific education, he ended up working as an instructor at the Tongwenguan, which is the School of Combined Learning, which was one of the earliest examples of a combined Chinese Western style education institution. And this was in Beijing. He quickly, though, moved then to head up the translation department at the Jiangnan Arsenal, which was the largest became the largest manufacturer of armaments in East Asia for the latter part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century. And he was their technical translator. He oversaw all of the creation of the scientific and practical technical manuals that were used in the creation of armaments, right? They were making a modern Chinese army was the goal of this. And this is where he spent the majority of his career. But he also branched out and set up this institution, the Gezhi Shuyuan, the Shanghai Polytechnic Institute. And this is an idealized vision of what their exhibition hall was going to look like. It was supposed to look like the Crystal Palace in London. But they never realized the building of that. It only ever existed in architectural drawing form. But it was meant to, it eventually actually has been realized in a certain way with the Shanghai Expo several years back in 2010, was the kind of culmination of the early seeds that were planted in this time more than 100 years before to have an exhibition hall for science and industry centered in Shanghai. He also edited this Gezhi Huibian, which is the Chinese scientific magazine, which despite the cover page is it's not bilingual, it's all in Chinese. And this is the introduction of all sorts of articles on theoretical topics in science, but also practical manufacture, and then also news and history from the West. So it covered all sorts of areas. The next thing that that's very important to our study over these past 8 weeks is the collections of prize essay contest winning entries. And in addition to reading the novels, David and I started to read the essays that led up to the novels because we needed to put the novels in this particular historical context, and David will have a few things to say about them. I want to show you a few examples. I should say that the fiction contest was run in 1895. So there were hundreds of submissions. It was extremely popular, and Fryer collected the manuscripts of the novels. Here's an example of some of the manuscript copies of these novels. But contrary to what he originally said, he was going to publish the winning entries into this fiction contest. He never did because he was employed by the University of California, and he sailed away from Shanghai to Berkeley with a trunk or boxes full of several, over 100 submissions, novel submissions. And there they languished in California until they were rediscovered in 2008 by a librarian who was cataloging uncatalogued materials. And they were then published in facsimile form in 2010. So this is brand new archival material that almost no scholars have written on. David and I did a literature review, and there are a small handful of articles that are trickling out now. One person, very famous scholar who was my mentor when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, he wrote about the fiction contest prior to the discovery of the archive. So it was known that the contest had taken place, but it was assumed that all the novels were lost. But now we have the novels, and basically what David and our task was this summer was to start to read all of these novels. And going through the manuscripts is quite fascinating. Sometimes the handwriting is frustrating. None of them are punctuated. The language, as David will tell you too, is it's relatively colloquial Chinese, but it's also colloquial Chinese from 120 years ago or more. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to figure out exactly what they're saying. We spent some time puzzling over different passages and trying to figure out what they were trying to express through those passages. These are just beautiful examples of the manuscript editions. Some of them were hand illustrated too, so people who submitted to the contest also submitted illustrations to their fiction. We're going to focus in very quickly on 5 examples that we spent a lot of time reading today. And I'm going to let Dawei take over and introduce those 5 novels and what he thinks of as the salient points of them.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And this is basically the 5 examples of our novel series that Daniel picked out for both of you to read. The first one is called 闷食偶谈. We translate it as the casual remarks of a nitpicker. and and it was written by 古润清廉后人. I will come back to those authors later. And the second one we read is 浦里萧下记. We roughly translate as a story of Edo away the summer. The third one is 达官道人闲游记. Edo travels of Master 达官. And the fourth one is 实心小说, a contemporary novel, which also could mean no title, because the whole contest is about contemporary novel.
Yeah.
And the last one we run into is 朴胜心谈. It's new remarks, but nothing special. So those are the.
Do you want to do the authors now, or do you want me to?
No,
oh, okay. Okay.
So this is the envelope that this novel, Casual Remarks of a Nitpicker, was sending to Shanghai to 格致书院 by John Fryer, and his author is 古润清廉后人, and we figure out what 古润means. 古润 is a place. The place is Zhenjiang, which still exists as a city nearby to Shanghai, and the Qinglian is the name of a very famous poet in history, which is Li Bai, and he is considered as one of the greatest poet in Chinese history. So we think the author of 闷师偶谈 is indeed one of his grandchildren or something. So at least he have a surname of Li. This is what we figure out. And this novel has a consistent story with well-designed storyline. That the point is this is a unity. This is a story of unity that that the author had the ability to write a good story and worked on realism, historical settings by using contemporary events, make this novel into a fine novel. And the event we are talking about was based on the Sino-Japanese War, starting August 1894 and ending April 1895. So, and a very well-written story with their feet on the historical fact. And yeah, the second, thank you. The second one here we find is 浦里萧下记, a story of Edo away the summer. And this author is actually much more ambitious than the first one, and he wants to trying to explain something and show his knowledge of things. But the author is not. This author has his first chapters really well written. He foreshadows some problems of China via Western doctor, referring food binding, essay writing, and opium smoking as three illnesses in this country. But people at that time heard his words, does not understand what he was talking about. So they have no idea that these three evilness has become the biggest problem for China. And this one was written in a more traditional Chinese novel way. We can find it from its index and the first chapter. And indeed, it is trying to emit the style of, of Dream of the Red Chamber. So the very famous Chinese historical novel. And the next one we have is the Edo Travels of Master Da Guan. And we can find from this title it was very different than the other novels we have. This is written in the style in the narrative form of a travel journal, and basically our main character, the fictional character, travels around the country and listen to people talking about their stories. And this novel was focusing on mainly two refugee experience happened in during the late Qing period of China. First is the famine in central China, and second is the Boxer, not the Boxer Rebellion, not yet, the Taiping Rebellion in southern China. And it was another form of very realistic a novel, but using a chronicle way to describe the detail of the events. But some of them have contained rumors and legends with extremely violent details. Like in one chapter, it's talking about how the Taiping Rebellion will chop off a woman's feet, bounded woman's feet, and pile them up and into a food mountain. So this, we're not sure it's real or not. But and the next one is the contemporary novel without a title or with a title. And this is a very interesting one that have some historically valuable sources on the way how women were binded their feet during the late 19th century period. And also we have the previous picture, of how during that period of time, late Qing Victorian period of time, how women were dressed in all different cultures. We can find out this one is definitely Qing Dynasty. And this is Victorian period England. And the rest are extremely weird, and we have and there is explanation of some of these are from North American tribes, and the one here with a pointy out of the head, it's actually part of her head, so we're not sure where this come from. And
there's some kind of transmission of ethnographic literature from the West to China, and it's garbled in the transmission in some way. So we haven't yet been able to identify the illustrations from the original. They're presumably actually photographs that these were hand sketched from of ethnographic works from the West, but we haven't yet to identify the original source. But there is a source for them out there. It's just that it's very vaguely described, and we presume that actually this is probably a hat that was then transformed into according to the novel, the skull was squeezed and turned into a long point like that.
Next one. And here is a series of different style of way of binding food by actually regional difference. This is very new and how to say, because there's understanding of the food binding had different styles of them, but it was usually didn't describe as in regional differences. And also here we find one which is the fake one, because some women refuse to bind their feet, but they still need to look as they have a small one. So they make one out of wood and hiding their real one away. So yeah, they can walk on stilts. And oh, where am I? No, can we go back to it a little bit? Yeah, I haven't finished with this one yet. And in the contemporary novel, we also have a paragraph of a novel that was written entirely in Wu dialect, which is one of the southern dialects in China, and which is where I grew up with. And so I understand those, but sometimes Daniel don't have the ability to read the whole paragraph. And this is also the interesting part of this novel. And the next one is Piao Shen Xing Tan. Piao Shen Xing Tan, the author is very interesting. He named himself, the pen name, a fabulous special pupil from Land of Zhao. So, and definitely his written work is fabulous. Land of Zhao is understand in between Henan and Hebei district of China, so central China. but we're not sure where he really come from. Maybe his ancestors come from there. And this is a fiction with mixed surrealism. The author has the ability to write extremely good stories, but sometimes he lost his plot. And as the story carries on, there are extremely unrealistic adventures happening in the stories, and it happened under a fictional setting of China during the late 19th century. And the main character of this novel is 3 young men and their good friends. And they all do different things that was amazing and incredible, and trying to solve one of the problems that China have. And one of them was trying to fix food binding, and he used a very innovation way by invent blow-up shoes that could relieve women's binded feet. And he is a person with extremely fashion ideas and capitalistic spirit, that he was going to promote his shoes to the prostitutes, so it could become a fashion. And he create a fashion industry out of that, so people could follow up those prostitutes to look fabulous, and nobody would bind their feet anymore. So this is the way he's trying to solve the binding feet problem. And one of his friends established a rehab center to help people. Fiction, right? Yeah, true. Okay, yeah, I think we remember this. And one of his friends started a rehab center trying to help people stop smoking opium. And where he got his found? He find them in a cave, and there's loads of gold inside. So crazy story. And another good friend of these 3 people gang eventually become an ambassador to England, and he had the opportunity to meet Queen Victoria and convince her to stop selling opium to China. Okay, this is not the end of the story yet. And on his way back to China, he was almost got assassinated by an opium dealer on the boat. He was saved by his martial art master friend, who have an idea of having female troops in the army. So those are very innovative ideas. And in this novel, we actually find one of the earliest English conversation ever appeared in a Chinese novel. So I'm thinking about reading them out.
Yeah, so the conversation is actually in English right here.
Yeah.
Dawei will read it out to you to see if you understand what they're saying.
So, yeah. 孟兰笑了一笑，先开口道 ：“Goodbye。”任清也笑道 ：“Goodbye。”孟兰道 ：“Where to you come from？” 任清道：“弗朗英伦的。”孟兰道：“How long have you been in China？” 任清道：“第一是滇叶氏，姓是 I come to China。”孟兰道：“An I 少未师有切尔有茉莉。”任清道：“登反游 You are to 古德。”翁英土游 an I 茉莉伊纳府佩德诺丁土波德诺丁土波土的阿福。And this is that's actually English, and it's a dialogue. And we also have a Chinese translation written by the author that does not fit with each other.
Did any of you catch any of the conversation?
Yeah, and basically what they're saying is there's 2 characters. One's called Meng Lan, another one is called Ren Qing. And Meng Lan starts to say goodbye, and the Ren Qing respond as goodbye. This how they start conversation. Must be something wrong. So, and Meng Lan, the character, starts to say, "Where do you come from?" 为尔土由康夫朗。 And 人情 respond as from England. 梦兰道 How long have you been in China? And 人情道 This is 10 years since I come to China. 梦兰 asks and I shall wish you cheer, you merry. 人情 respond as Thank you, you are too good. Owing to you, I am merry. Enough paid, nothing to bother of. So these are the parts that don't make any sense, but we are still trying to figure out that part. And
oh, sure, yeah. So we had a lot more to say, but I just want to read you a few now. So that's an example of translation of a sort. I'm going to give you now 2 excerpts from 2 chapters from the casual remarks of a nitpicker. And I'll warn you in advance that they're kind of disturbing. So you know, I don't want to traumatize anyone, but they deal with traumatic subjects. And it will give you a flavor for the novels. The characters should be self-explanatory. They're introduced in the course of my translation. So this is my translation, and it could be refined, but this is what I have for you now. Wu Shen had a sister who had married a local man called Zhu Xuezheng, whose father and elder brothers had all died some time ago. A clever man, Mr. Zhu, had moved while still young to the town of Niuzhuang and set himself up in trade. After some 20 years, having done quite well for himself, he moved his entire family thither, the better to take care of them. The previous year, however, he died, leaving behind his wife and 2 daughters who, due to his foresight, had no financial worries. Nevertheless, they were alone in a foreign place with no relatives to rely upon. Just as they were thinking of leaving Niuzhuang to move back to Haicheng, which is the city that they came from, they suddenly received news of the death of Mrs. Zhu's old mother, thus hastening their departure. When they arrived in Haicheng, since the old woman had not been interred yet, Mrs. Zhu collapsed to the ground, stretched out her arms around the coffin, and wailed for a while. Then she was received by her brother and sister-in-law. Since brother and sister had not seen each other for many years, they recounted to each other all that had transpired in that time, talking for an entire day and through an entire night. Then Wu Shen, that's the brother, said, "Sister, there is no need for you to look for anywhere else to stay. There are 3 rooms in the front of the house that I can let you have. Later, by chance, you might find something more suitable. You can move there then, of course." Mrs. Zhu responded, "Splendid. I won't move until after mother is buried then." Thus, she and her daughters moved into the 3 rooms. The older daughter, 7 years of age, was called Ah Pei. The younger, who was 5, was called Ah Zhu. Both of them were skinny and of rather weak constitution, but Ah Pei seemed the more pitiable of the 2. Mrs. Zhu, who was still no more than 30 years old, had an irritable temper. In all matters, whether big or small, she had to get the better of others. If something did not satisfy, she was quick to anger and curse, and she was quite harsh in her discipline of her daughters. Day in and day out, whenever they did something to upset her, she would strike them and scold them. Although they were her own children, she treated them worse than a stepmother. When Mrs. Zhu first arrived to live with her brother, she got along quite well with her sister-in-law. But, swayed by household gossip, the 2 parties eventually cooled towards each other. One day, as Ah Pei was playing with her cousin, laughing and tripping through the courtyard, she slipped and caused her cousin to fall down. When Mrs. Zhu heard Ah Lian crying, she came to investigate and dragged her daughter Ah Pei back with her to her rooms, where she gave Ah Pei a sound thrashing. "You're 7 years old, yet you're not helping out with the household chores," she yelled. "Instead, you're out about running this way and that, causing trouble. It's time I bound your feet. Let's see how quick you'll run then." So the next day, Mrs. Zhu tore up some strips of cloth to bind Ah Pei's feet. Normally, when people begin this process, they start with the wrappings rather loose, only gradually tightening them over time. But Mrs. Zhu had her own way of proceeding. It was in her character to want to accomplish everything in a single day. That someone might have smaller feet than her daughter was a thought she simply could not bear. So, from the very start, she bound her daughter's feet as tightly as possible. Alas, poor Ah Pei. As we've mentioned, she was weak by nature. Now, with tightly bound feet, she could not walk at all. She cried and sniveled all day and hardly touched any of her food. On top of that, her mother still beat her and cursed at her. One day, when returning to his own apartments, Wu Shen, the brother, caught sight of Ah Pei in this sorry state. He knew at once it was because of her having her feet bound too tightly. So he said to his sister, "I can see that my niece has a weak constitution, and Her health won't hold up under this much pain. Why don't you loosen the bandages for now and take things more slowly? There's no need to rush things. Oh, brother, you don't realize how unruly this one is, running about here and there, said Mrs. Drew. She's really gotten under my skin. If I don't bind her feet up tightly, there's no telling where she might run off to. I only bring this matter up with you with the best of intentions because the child is so pitifully skinny, her brother replied. I'm not telling you not to bind her feet, just to go about it more slowly. Of course, it's none of my business, I suppose. Mrs. Drew said, then, brother, let it be. Let it be. There'll be opportunity aplenty for you to express your concerns when the time comes for your daughter, Alian, to get her feet bound. Seeing that he was making no headway with his sister, Wu Shen pursued the matter no further and continued on his way. So that gives you a sense of the kind of family drama and the realism with which this situation is portrayed in the novel. The next shorter episode, that's the foot binding problem dealt with in the nitpicking novel. The next is a combination of opium smoking and examination taking, and the context here is the man who's going to take the examinations is an opium addict. The night before the big examination, that's the character here, his name is Liu Yucheng. He spent the night in the opium den where he smoked a dozen or so balls of opium. Then, so that he wouldn't go into withdrawal during the exam itself, he prepared by wrapping up some opium in a piece of oiled paper, putting it in a basket with his other supplies. Then, just before leaving for the exam, he smoked another pipe and walked, basket in hand, towards the examination hall. There was a delay in opening the main gate to the hall, so that when the doors finally swung open, all the candidates surged in, pressing up one against each other. It was at this point that the package of opium, which was not that large, slipped to the ground through an opening in the basket. The basket was the kind with loose weave, with pepper kernel-sized holes. But Liu Yucheng was too occupied with pressing forward with the rest of the examination candidates to notice. Once everyone was seated in his assigned cubicle, the examination hall doors were closed and sealed shut. The essay topics were announced. Their heads, filled with thoughts of the glory they might win, all the candidates hunched over their desks writing. In no time at all, Liu Yucheng had finished the introduction to his essay and made a fair copy of it. Furthermore, since he had smoked so much earlier, he felt no opium cravings yet. By 1 o'clock, he had already finished drafts of 2 more essays and the required poem. At this point, he began to feel hungry, so he had a snack from his basket. Then the cravings came. He'd have to have some opium before he could make a fair copy of his work. But when he reached into the basket, he couldn't find the package. After an initial shock, he calmed himself down and thought it must have fallen on the floor. When a thorough search of his cubicle yielded no opium, however, he stamped his foot and exclaimed, "Woe is me, woe is me." Beads of sweat the size of beans fell from his forehead. What shall I do? I have nothing copied out except for the introduction to 1 essay. He tried to lift up his brush, but his hand shook. Snot ran out his nose, and pain shot through his belly. When some of the other candidates saw him in this state, they thought to themselves, there's no way that he's going to be able to finish the exam. Someone said, if you're going to shit yourself, do it outside the cubicles. We don't want the stench getting stuck on our papers. That's it. So, thank you for listening. That's where we're at. Any questions?
So will you now conduct the contest and pick a winner?
The winners were already ranked. So when the archive was found, there was a list announced of who the winners were. So we can match the novels to the list. The one problem is the first prize novel is missing. It was probably at the top of the box, so it probably got thrown out somehow. So we have from second prize onward. And the novel that I was just reading you from, which I think is actually better than the second prize novel. I quite like that novel. It's quite a powerful novel. That's came in about 5th.
You can do your own new contest, though.
Yeah, I re-ranked them myself. I don't, I think that because they were clearly had different criteria that they were looking for when they were ranking them.
Opium smoking and foot binding, the social concerns for that are fairly clear. Can you talk a little bit about why exams were a social concern?
I think why the exams become the social concern is first the form of the examination haven't been changed for almost 500.
Yeah, it varies, but yeah, say.
But the material for them to study was written 2,000 years ago. And there's nothing concern science or modern usage of this novel. Those are pure humanities of those examinations, and some of them are war strategies, but nothing contemporary or, as we call it right now, scientific was happening during the examination. And especially in the late Qing dynasty, that most of Western countries have already had their industrial revolution and building machines that could change people's life. And during China, we're still trying to purify our mind by Confucius Analect and the Confucius Classic. So they consider the examinations supposed to be changed.
The prize essay contest that was run for the 10 years previous to the fiction contest was an attempt to use the examination essay model to address scientific topics. So we were going to talk a little bit about that, but we just didn't have time. But the essays that we read, they're all about, how do you build the best warship? How do you, what are the best ways of translating chemical terminology into Chinese? They were very practically oriented. But Fryer grew frustrated with the results of this, and at this point, this was kind of a turning point, the Sino-Japanese War, when the Chinese had modernized their navy, but nevertheless were defeated in the war, and many of their ships were sunk, and they were feeling very demoralized, and they thought that all of the efforts to adopt this kind of Western technology through the more traditional means of the examination system and so on had failed. So they were turning against the examination system at that time.
Some that are really trying to play up to it, but others that might be trying to subvert it or kind of doing their own thing with it. Can you give us a sense of the range of responses?
Definitely. So we had kind of even put the novels here in an order, from the nitpicker one down to the crazy one with the blow-up shoes, from kind of gritty realism, which was what I was reading to you, to a fantastic, almost sci-fi kind of feel for things. So you can see a range of styles and approaches to the problems. You can also see different. Clearly, there's a missionary point of view on these issues, especially foot binding. I'll just the story that Dawei was telling about the blow-up shoes and the prostitutes. The missionaries were not fans of prostitutes either, but the novel uses prostitution and the system of courtesans in Shanghai and Beijing as just a fact of everyday life, that they're kind of and they can actually solve the problem of foot binding if we convince the trendsetters, who are the courtesans in our society, to change how they wear their clothes and what they do. It's like getting Kim Kardashian to wear your whatever, right? Then everyone's going to wear it. So this guy had this idea that was clearly not in line with what a typical missionary wanted as a product, in response to this prompt. But and there are numerous examples like that.
So the box included a list of prize winners. Were the prize winners, is there any evidence prize winners were ever announced in China? So how far did the contest?
Oh yeah, they were announced in the newspaper, and
so the books weren't published.
They were.
But the contest in some sense came to.
Yeah, and they got their money. They got prize money. Yeah. Oh, I should have mentioned one thing, that David and I are continuing on with this in the next semester, and this is kind of the outline of a descriptive paper that I'm working on. Of course, we need to put in the kind of theoretical and ideas component of it, what this means for translation in the Sino-Western context of the early 20th century, late 19th century, but it's well on its way.